the young adult group went out and bought this when I was teaching them a long time ago. Okay? Why this translation? I'll tell you in a minute. Let me tell you the other translations that you can get, because there are other approved translations. The New American Bible, that's another. It's also called the St. Joseph's Bible. That's an approved translation. Aha, see? Vic's got one. That was the first Catholic Bible I bought when I was converting, because it's the most popular version. The New Jerusalem Bible. This is the Bible that Mother Angelica would read from on her broadcasts. And she expressly spoke about when you buy a New Jerusalem Bible, you get it that is copyrighted 1966. Don't get a modern, up-to-date translation, because apparently the New Jerusalem Bible has gone through some revisions in which they were putting inclusive language into the scriptures. So you get a translation prior to 1966. Just a little caveat there.
They still have
the other, huh?
They still have it before 1966.
I believe that they do. You just have to look around for it. The Douay-Rheims translation. Now the Douay-Rheims translation is an old translation. It is basically the Catholic version of the King James Bible, which is the same thing. Douay-Rheims, Douay translation. They were both translated roughly in the same year. The King James Bible came out in 1611. The Douay-Rheims came out in 1609. So it was around the same century that they came out. They have the same type of language. You'll see these and thous and this's and that'is and stuff like that. You know, it's like reading Shakespeare. So if you want a Catholic version of Shakespeare's Bible, get the Douay-Rheims. Now, we kind of make fun of it, but there are certain parts of the Douay-Rheims translation that are really quite well done, especially the Lord's Prayer, believe it or not. They actually translate it more accurately than our modern translations, I would argue. So I'll just throw that out there. Now there are other things that they don't, like the Proto-Evangelium, completely different in the Douay-Rheims than in a modern translation. Completely different pronouns, and that's a big deal to talk about later. I mentioned it's an Old English version. So this is the Bible that I recommend. It's called the Revised Standard Version, Second Catholic Edition, otherwise known as the Ignatius Bible. Why do I recommend it? Because while each of these Bibles has its strengths, I'm recommending this because it is the best translation that we have today for everyday reading, and it is probably the most accurate to the original languages. All translations of the Bible will suffer in some way or another. It's just inevitable. You cannot not get around it. So unless you want to learn how to read Greek and Hebrew for yourself, you're going to have to rely on the English translations. And there will be some, you know, you have to, some liberties are being taken when you translate anything from one language to another. What?
The St. Joseph Bible.
American Bible.
That's the New American Bible. Yeah, St. Joseph's Bible is the New American version. What's the big drawback of the St. Joseph's Bible is that it's too liberal in its translation. It's too free. It's not as accurate to the original languages. What they've done is made it more readable and less accurate. So there's more of a suffering of the translation than in the new, in the Revised Standard Version. So that's why I'm recommending it. It may seem a little bit more, not choppy, but it's more accurate. That's the best way I can describe it. All right, yes?
What about the new Jeff Clavin's Ascension Press Bible they've been advertising?
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, it says in press has it. It's revised by Jeff Clavens and Scott Hahn and those.
That sounds pretty much like the Ignatius Bible Study, which uses the Revised Standard Version. Okay? What's in here? Oh, that's what's in here. Okay. So that's the one I'm recommending. If you want to follow along with me, you can get it like this. You can get large print. Okay? This is regular print. You can get it in leatherback. You can get it in hardback. You can get it in paperback. You can get it in all kinds. All right? Where can you get it? Amazon. How much will it cost you? Between
$30, 30, 40.
45.
depending on whether you get hardback, softback, paperback, leather, like mine, it'll cost you anywhere between $29 to $39. So $29.95 to $39.95, depending on what kind of covering you're getting. All right?
Where is that large print? Can I see that?
This is another question I get all the time. I've never read the Bible. Where do I begin? I'm going to give you what I call Chip's Reader's Digest version to the Bible. Don't just pick up the Bible and start reading it. Okay? Because again, I said this last week, I'll say it again. Many people say, oh, my New Year's resolution is I'm going to finally read the whole Bible. And they get started in Genesis and they're fine. They make it into Exodus and they're okay. Then they hit what? Leviticus, and they say, forget it. I have no idea what I'm reading. All right, and they quit. Okay, so let me tell you a way to read through the Bible.
Large print.
You need to keep the flow of the narrative. You need to get the story of the Bible. Remember, the Bible is not written chronologically. It's broken up. So you want to follow the chronology. All right? So, start with Genesis. You need the beginning. Read Exodus. Skip Leviticus. Go to the book of Numbers. That's where the story picks up. Now, in Jeff Cavens' Bible timeline, you know this that I told you also to get? They don't recommend reading Deuteronomy. I am. All right? Why? Because in Deuteronomy you have the death of Moses. So if you want to find out what happens to Moses, you have to, once you start in Exodus and Numbers, you want to find out what happened to him. So read Deuteronomy. Then you find out what happens to him. Then what? Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay? I put Daniel in parentheses as an optional read, only if you want to get some feeling for what the prophets are like, because it is the most narrative book of the prophets. Okay?
Which one, Jim?
Daniel. But you don't have to. You won't necessarily lose the narrative. It might detract you. So it's optional. So after 2 Kings, you should read Ezra, then Nehemiah, and then the book of 2 Maccabees. That is basically more or less what they recommend with this. So Genesis covers the early world. Exodus talks about the flight from Egypt. Numbers talks about the desert wanderings. And so does Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy ends the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. Then you begin the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. You settle in Judges. Okay? You're still conquering, but you settle in Judges. Judges then lead you into the united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. That's what you find in 1st and 2nd Kings.
I have Ruth
Yes, good.
after Judges.
Don't read it. Right? Why? Because it's going to detract you from the story.
Okay.
Right? After the death of Solomon, the kingdom is divided. And so that takes you all the way through the book of 2nd Kings. Then you go into exile. That's why I kind of recommend Daniel, because Daniel tells you what it's like when you go into exile. Daniel also prophesies the return from the exile. And so you return under Ezra and Nehemiah. So you come back to the land. And then what? You stay there. And then you have the Maccabees. The Maccabees tell you what happens after the last prophet and before the coming of Jesus. So the Maccabees tells you what happens in the period called the intertestamental period. Okay? What does that mean? It means the period in between the testaments, between the old and the new. Okay? Then what? Then you read the book of Luke. That's the New Testament. Why Luke? Because Luke was written for Gentiles to understand the story of Jesus. It also begins with something that you know, Christmas. It also is the book that has the 5 joyful mysteries of the Rosary. All 5 joyful mysteries of the Rosary are in the book of Luke, and only the book of Luke. So you get to something very familiar with Jesus. Also, Luke wrote Acts. So what Jesus began in Luke, he continues in his church in Acts. So once you finish with Luke, you read Acts. And that tells you the history of the church up until the time just before the death of St. Paul. And then what? The last book you read is the book of Revelation. Why? Because that tells you about the new heavens and the new earth, and we've made one full cycle from Genesis to Revelation. What you lose in Genesis, you gain in Revelation. Paradise lost, paradise regained. That's the story of the Bible, from the beginning to the end. Once again, Jeff Cavins and them don't recommend reading the book of Revelation. I do, only because it kind of puts an end to everything that you began. All right? Now that's the Reader's Digest condensed version of the Bible. When we go through the scriptures from now until who knows when, I'm following this path. We're going to start in Genesis, we're going to go through Exodus, we're going to go through Numbers, we're going to hit the death of Moses and then go into the conquest. Then we're going to go into the Judges. Then we're going to go into the kingdom. We're going to split the kingdom. Then we're going to go into exile. Then we're going to come back from exile. Then we're going to maintain a monarchy for about 100 years under the Maccabees. And then Jesus comes. And then the church. And then where is the end of history going? The new heavens and the new earth at the end of the book of Revelation. You see that? That's the Bible in summary. Well, what about Ruth? What about Psalms? What about the Song of Solomon? What about St. Paul and his letters? How does all that fit in? See, these books that I'm telling you give you the narrative story of the Bible. All those other books hang in different parts of the narrative. So if you had like a string here with all these books, when you see the book of Ruth, you put it in the area of Judges, because that's when it occurred. When you see the book of Tobit, you put that in the book of 2 Kings, because that's where it occurred. When you see the book of Esther, you put that near the 2 Kings because it happened during that time. When you see the book of Isaiah, he was in the period of time just before the exile. So again, over here and so forth. When you read the book of Acts, you will find out when St. Paul wrote his letters. Thessalonians, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, the Philippians, etc. Okay? So all of those books fit within the story element. You can actually buy a Bible called the Chronological Bible, in which scholars have put together this kind of order, and they've ordered or structured all the books of the Bible in a narrative sort of way. So you read a psalm when it was supposed to be written and so forth. And so it's more of a narrative structure. It's a Protestant Bible, but nevertheless, it's a good idea. I admired the idea because it gives you the timeline in which the books were written. So for example, you find out when Paul wrote the first part of the New Testament that was ever written was the book of 1 Thessalonians. It was written most likely in the 50s. St. Paul's first letter. So that was like after his first missionary journey. So it was like early in the book of Acts that he wrote that. Okay? So you get a sense of how, and like the book of 2 Timothy is like towards the end, after the book of Acts. Because it's the last thing that St. Paul wrote. How do you know that? Because he talks about he's about to die. Okay? And then all the others fit in this sort of timeline. And so, again, strongly recommend you get something like this. It's only $5. It helps you. Now, what you can't see from there is, for example, right here in the divided kingdom, it shows the book of Obadiah, the book of Joel, Amos, Jonah, Tobit, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah. It shows where all the other books fit in the order of where things happen. So like